21 Lessons of Merlyn, Chapter 4, The Haunted Mountain. There's lots of haunted mountains around here. Introduction. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source... Oi! It is the source of all true art and science. Be quiet. He to whom the emotion is a stranger. Are you listening?
I can't hear you.
Are you listening?
No. Can't hear you. Yeah.
He to whom the emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead.
What are you reading?
I'm reading a story. Yeah, I'm reading you a story. The insight into the mystery of life, coupled though it be with fear, has also given rise to religion. To know what is impenetrable to us really exists, manifesting itself as the highest wisdom and the most radiant beauty, which our dull faculties can comprehend only in their most primitive forms. This knowledge, this feeling, is at the centre of true religiousness. And that's a little introduction that was spoken by Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was my granddad. He was a famous scientist or something like that. He invented something, and he said that the most important thing to have was the sense of the mysterious, to understand mysterious stuff. Right. The events of the summer wandered slowly into autumn, as my anxious hope for Merlyn's next visit passed likewise into discouragement. He didn't think he was going to see Merlyn again, young Arthur. It was not that my enthusiasm towards apprenticeship had all lessened, but only that it was difficult for me to understand why my newfound teacher had apparently chosen to abandon me without so much as a word. After all, I had carefully completed each task with which he had left me. My druidic symbols of mastery were constructed to the best of my ability, and no animal flesh had touched my lips for many months. I hadn't eaten meat, I'd eaten only vegetables and fruit. And every day I washed my new robe in the woodland spring, by which I afterwards meditated on those lessons of magic that Merlyn had taught me. Exactly as I had been told. But when empty weeks became lonely months with no sign of another visit, it was little wonder that I began to question whether Merlyn had judged me unworthy to hear the responsibility of his teachings. The final days of October were upon Britain, and the fields of pumpkin lay ready for harvest, their bright orange treasures standing hidden amongst a brown nest of tangled vines. Ready? No sooner was the harvest completed than delegations began to arrive, as they did each year at this time, to celebrate the high mass of All Souls' Day. Where was I? They were talking about All Souls' Day was on its way. Halloween. It's Halloween, it's Halloween, it's Halloween. And these are haunted mountains around here. There's lots of warriors around here. So, activities were scheduled to begin. The party was going to begin shortly, the following morning. And already 20 priests and bishops had arrived with their many novices. To accommodate them all for the duration, many of us were forced to vacate our bedrooms in favour of sleeping outside under the stars. A sacrifice I never minded, actually. I liked sleeping under the stars, especially when I have a fancy tent like this one. Well, he didn't have a tent. Arthur didn't have a tent. What? What? always preferring accommodations of nature to those of man, and to my great delight that particular night was no exception. Iltud and I were among the first so required. Our community was especially busy that November Eve, as the number of visitors far surpassed what we had expected. But at last, after all preparations were complete, both saint and sinner lumbered off, thinking only of sleep. I knew the night was a special one, a night all Christian men seemed to fear, a night to remain inside behind fire and hearth, with door firmly bolted, for it was Samhain, All Hallows Eve, Halloween night. Closed and locked shut. All the doors were closed and locked shut. They didn't do trick-or-treating in those days. They just hid away from the ghosts and spooks and spectres and the spirits of the mountains and all that. Many were the times I had lain awake far into the night, listening with strained ears as my older companions whispered tales of demons and deathly spirits which roamed the earth from dusk to dawn, searching for living souls to torment as they themselves were tormented. Even though I found such stories hard to believe, their mere mention filled me with longings for adventure. Longings that the tales just might be true. Something I did know for certain was that the common folk built immense bonfires throughout the darkest hours in an effort to keep the forces of the other world at bay. This at least I had seen myself. Each Samhain, since earliest childhood, I had somehow managed to steal away after everyone was asleep, watching in wonder until dawn as hundreds of fires blazed off the mainland like a sea of giant fireflies in the autumn dark. This particular Halloween being colder than usual, I snuggled deep beneath my mound of woolen blankets, shivering with thoughts of the heavy frost which would surely cover all by morning. My companion in exile, Iltud, had done the same. His heavy breathing told me that he was already asleep just a few feet away. In fact, save for a handful of yellow lamps burning behind shuttered windows, the entire settlement seemed at rest. Overhead, the sky was filled with pools of brilliant stars, as I watched intently in hopes of seeing one streak across the firmament at blinding speed, a shooting star. Then the annual thought of making off to view the Samhain bonfires crossed my mind, while the night air's crisp bite soon convinced me that the idea could wait. And so, counting my 9th shooting star, I finally passed into a sound sleep. Normally the quietness of Tintagel on a late fall evening was broken by the untiring sound of the sea, or by a choir of crickets in the surrounding meadows, what in winter. But on that eve I was roused by a sound distinctly foreign to the island, a ghostly sound of musical design. Still uncertain whether I dreamed or not, the voice of an unseen flute rose clearly above the pre-dawn calm. I threw off my coverings and made a hasty yet uncertain estimate as to the direction from which it came, aware of how deceptively sound travels on a cold, damp night. My ears soon brought me to the front gate and beyond, down the road, over the bridge and onto the mainland. Fortune was with me, for both the gate and the roadway were empty as I passed through the monastery grounds undetected. Only 3 times in my life had I ventured far from the settlement, and then only to assist a trading party back from Bosini Manor. So acute had my senses become as a result of Merlyn's teachings that neither the slightest sound nor motion ended my attention as I moved silently toward town. The flute's drifting tones grew louder as the distance from Tintagel increased. All along the way the fields were alive with fire. Groups of people huddled close to escape the darkness and black superstitions of Samhain. Occasionally I happened by gatherings of folk dressed in festive colours and wearing grotesquely carven masks, no doubt in an attempt to frighten off the wandering spectres of death, whose presences were everywhere to be felt upon that night. And at other places the roadsides were heavily strewn with the unconscious bodies of men and women who had drunken themselves into a stupor out of sheer terror or dread. Suddenly there was a shuffling in the tall grass beside me. I spun around sharply and there came face to face with a magnificent stallion, the donkey from Shrek.
Yeah, you
Did I already say that? And
past it was tied securely to the saddle.
sapling, yeah, young tree, tied securely to a young tree. His bright eyes were darting wildly about. Where did you come from? I started in surprise, freezing instantly as a shadowy figure emerged from behind the horse. Why, he's mine, came the familiar voice in answer. And a good thing too. You and I will have much need of his swiftness before this night has come to an end. The voice, of course, was Merlyn's. And what took you so long, young Arthur? Chuckled the druid as he stepped into the light. This time, who is waiting for whom, eh? Before having a chance to speak, I was ushered inside the grove by the fire, where we spent the next hour recounting in hushed tones all that had happened since our last meeting. Oh, I've lost my place. No, I haven't. There it is. There will be no further need for fire tonight, said Merlyn, eyeing the flames, which had reduced themselves to a pile of glowing embers. For the Mother Moon is plenty full enough to see us on our way. Here I noticed that the druid was not dressed in his usual blue robes, but wore instead a black cape, which caused his face alone to be visible against the dark background in the woods. This I found so out of character that I voiced my question as we prepared to depart. The colour black, he responded while fastening a strap, is symbolic of the deepest secrets of magic. I wear this colour when I wish to become one with the world and not stand apart from it. White represents all that is pure and visible in this sphere of Abrid, while black is a bridge to the other world. Black is the colour of true union. Merlyn tossed me a smaller version of his own robe and mentioned that I should put it on. Wear this so that we might join together in the world of mystery this evening. No sooner had I put the garment over my head than a long arm pulled me up onto the horse. With one quick tug of the reins we sped out over the veiled countryside as I clutched madly at the druid's robe for balance. After what seemed like hours of riding along endless trails, we paused for a moment in a small town where Merlyn commenced to ask the time from one of the many villagers busy tending roaring street fires. It was well into the 11th hour before we were out of town and back into the main road. That was the township of Exeter, Merlyn called back against the wind, which the Romans called Isca Domnonorium. Isca Domnoniorum in times past. Our destination lies not too far from here. Despite those words of assurance, I had just resigned myself to another long stretch of road when the horse was pulled to an abrupt stop. "Behold, we have arrived," the druid announced loudly, pointing straight ahead. Through a cloud of vapour ushering from the exhausted animal, I made out the silhouette of a broad hill looming before us. That was the township of Exeter, Merlyn called back against the wind which the Romans called Isca Dumnonorium in times long past. Our destination lies not too far away from here. Despite those words of assurance, I had just resigned myself to another long stretch of road when the horse was pulled up to an abrupt halt. "Behold, we have arrived," the Druid announced loudly, pointing straight ahead, through a cloud of vapour ushering from the exhausted animal. I made out the silhouette of a broad hill looming before us. "Quickly, we must follow that trail, lest midnight catch us unprepared," he added with a tense edge to his voice. Before I realized what was happening, the horse was hastily tied and we were making our way uphill along a narrow footpath, skirted on both sides by thick bushes. The air smelled wet and damp like a bog. Moisture glistened over everything in the pale moonlight. Clad in our black raiment, I doubted that even a keep-sighted owl would have detected our passage up that hillside, so much like shadows we must have appeared. Gone were the bonfire legions dotting the countryside. Gone were the masked crowds. Every bend was deadly silent, and I wondered at this. Soon we came to a sharp fork in the path, and Merlyn paused and said, "Here lies the barrier between the physical world and the other world. Here we must part company for a while, you and I." The Druid must have read the expression of horror across my face at that moment, for he continued at once, without permitting me a word in between. "Do you understand why it is that the festival night of Samhain is honoured by the Druids above all others?" I shook my head slowly, not certain that I was at all interested in hearing. "Because," he continued, "it is during this time and no other that the veil separating the world from the other world grows most thin, allowing countless worlds to pass among us with great ease. A time requiring careful control to overcome the fear it generates. As you have witnessed, the common folk know much of this fear, but little of what is needed to master it. Overstuffed bonfires and saintly prayers are all they know of wandering between worlds this night. But us, we are masters of such things. Masters." I watched in amazement as Merlyn's eyes kindled wildly into flame for an instant, and then died. He took a deep breath and smiled before resuming his typical reserve. "You, Arthur, have already tasted victory over the elemental kings. What remains on this eve are the demons of your own mind to conquer, the most formidable forces of all. To triumph in this challenge, you will earn the rank of Ovid, the first official order of Druidism. As long as you accomplish it alone and without aid of any kind, I will remain here awaiting your return. Go now. Your destiny lies along that way." Frightened,
I started towards the left fork down which Merlyn pointed, knowing that the first critical test of my apprenticeship lay ahead. The concept of try, I thought, no longer applied. This time I would either succeed or fail. As I moved ahead, I could just barely hear Merlyn murmuring some passage or spell under his breath, but it carried well enough through the night air. Faint light gleam over the hearth, ghosts of Arden pass through, and show your distant forms. Misty Loda, house to the spirits of men, when ghosts vanish like mists on a sunny hill, open your doors. Skirting cautiously along that unfamiliar passage, my imagination went wild, sending dozens of chilling memory fragments racing along my spine. What was it Merlyn said? Ah, yes, that Exeter and its hills used to serve as a Roman stronghold before the coming of Maximus. Childhood nightmares began to surface. Stories of bloody Roman legions and their merciless attacks against innocent Britons. No single image terrified me more than that of a Roman soldier hiding in ambush. And hadn't this very road been trodden into rubble by such barbarians? Even though I knew well the importance of keeping a tight grasp on emotions, my imagination still raced with chaotic thoughts that only a boy could have on an unabandoned road, late at night, alone, at a time when death itself walked abroad. Merlyn used to say that if it was not the task that really mattered, but only one's reaction to it. Trying to put that advice to use only quickened my pace until a large clearing opened suddenly ahead. As the spot grew closer, there emerged what seemed to be hundreds of small geometric shapes covering the ground, each aglow in the silver light. Not until this clearing stood fully exposed to view did the true horror of my situation become a reality. There before me, vast and silent, lay an ancient graveyard. Located on the very hilltop, it was a barren, weedy area about 50 rods square, surrounded on all four sides by tall hedges of unkempt tree and bush. After several minutes, I managed enough courage to walk within an arm's length of the tombstones, bending low to study the inscriptions which were still visible on a few. Vespasian hic jacet Felius Severus, read the first, while another, hic situs Tacedonius sternitur in Felix alieno vulnea. He falls unhappy by a wound intended for another, I translated slowly under my breath, struggling to bring the years of schooling into focus. Two things caught my attention. One was the language and lettering style employed on the carvings, and the other was the name Tacedonius. Somewhere in the deep recesses of my memory, the name made a connection, a Roman one, a writer or philosopher, perhaps. No, a leader, an emperor general. Suddenly it all made sense. The place, Isca Domnonorium, the Latin letters upon stone, the name Tacedonius, and the desolate appearance of the site itself, as if abandoned by a race vanished long ago. Ah, by the gods! Merlyn had sent me into the midst of a Roman graveyard. Just then the Exeter church bell tolled out the hour in the distance. and I counted silently as each stroke pierced the damp air. 12 in all. Midnight. Now it was clear why Merlyn had been so keen on reaching our destination in haste. He wanted me there during that dark hour. I stood completely still in the pale moonlight until the 12 ghostly echoes died away. Then from my right there came another sound, different, still, which turned the blood in my veins to ice. From out of the mist, at the very spot where I had stood only moments ago, something stirred. A low, painful moan spread over the silence like a wave. As if pushing my way through dark waters, I fought against fear to reach an ancient yew tree at the yard's edge. Climbing quickly onto the lowest bough, I peered out through the thick foliage just as an eerie blue fog began to gather on the surface of the ground. Each gravestone floated above the growing sea like 1,000 drowning heads waiting to be saved. Amidst it all, a solitary form began to materialize. It was a horrible apparition, clothed in a tattered frock through which its naked bones protruded, a being caught between the living and the dead. Half in fascination, half in terror, I studied the hideous form as it wove its way back and forth between the stones. And atop each grave that it passed, there emerged another creature, as grotesque, which joined at once in the task, like some hellish game of tag. I don't know how long the time elapsed during that macabre procession, but before long there were no less than 50 of them. Skeletal hands joined together in an ever-expanding ring, revolving clockwise. Each time a new corpse surfaced from its grave, the circle grew larger, until it became clear that the ring would soon engulf the tree where I sat. My heart raced as this cold reality took shape. Unavoidably, I was being surrounded by a sea of the dead. Many thoughts of escape occurred to me in those long minutes which followed, but my dread of discovery was far too great. At length it seemed certain that any chance I might once have had to flee was no longer possible. The spirit ring left only a few feet of vaporous space between my tree and the denizens of that nightmarish realm. I could all but smell the rotting flesh beneath their thin shards of clothing. Then suddenly the great dance came to a halt. In one unison motion, the spectres turned towards my tree and pointed hundreds of dead hands upward towards me. Unable to contain my fear, I let out one long scream as the yew limb crashed away from under me. When at last I was able to look about, the ghostly multitude had vanished. Rising stiffly, I took a quick survey of my body. No blood. My next concern was to locate the path down which I had come originally, but the mists which still dominated the field made that task nearly impossible. I wandered aimlessly for what must have been a quarter of an hour before locating what seemed to be the correct route. Breathing a sigh of relief, I stood upright, only to confront the sum total of all my fears blocking the way. Sinking to my knees in horror, the ghastly form of a Roman soldier stood over me, more imposing than any that I had ever imagined. dressed in battle array. It held high in its hand a long sword, dripping scarlet with blood, the blood of countless human heads which lay scattered about its feet. In a strange way, the figure seemed almost familiar, having lurked since childhood behind all of my most fervent nightmares. But this time I knew something was different. This time my nightmare had come upon me for my death. And at that moment I knew beyond all doubt that even a dream at times was enough to kill. From out this personal hell, I remember seeing the face of Merlyn floating among the mists as if to encourage me onward. Under the eyes of my mentor, I found the renewed conviction for one final effort. Breaking off a dead tree branch, I thrust it valiantly at the supernatural warrior with all my might. In the same instant, the silence was again broken by the Exeter church bell as it tolled out one mighty stroke. Instantly the phantom melted into nothingness along with the mists from which it had come. Just as my world faded into the blackness of cold earth, all things were still. I was brought back to life by the impatient hand of Iltud as he tugged and pulled at me through a thick pile of blankets. "What's the matter with you, Arthur? What's wrong?" he prodded. "You've been calling out as if the devil himself were chasing you. Wake up!" And with that, I awoke to a crisp colour of an autumn morning, as the last traces of frost were being eaten away by the bright sunlight. "Come on, Arthur, hurry up," yelled Iltud. "We'll be needed for the big feast today, and we've missed half the morning mass already." "Where's Merlyn?" I shot back, completely oblivious to my friend's words. "Did he escape safely from the mountain?" Iltud threw an exaggerated scowl in my direction. "That evil druid has not been here for many months now, and a good thing too." Then his face softened in curiosity for an instant. Escape from where, may I ask? What are you talking about?" "We were both gone for most of the night," I insisted in sudden confusion. "How could you not know this?" My companion walked over and sat down beside me as he folded his quills carefully. "It does not surprise me that your friendship with that pagan man has brought you nothing but troubled dreams," he said flatly. "You have been here all night with me, tossing and muttering in your sleep. But the daylight has come, so forget about it if you can." "Forget?" I flared. "But it was no dream." I took a long look around. "I don't think." Iltud finished piling up his coverings and started on mine. "Well, whatever the case," he added, "you'd better take that soiled robe of yours over to the tile house and give it a good wash. It's not fit for a swine to wear, let alone a Christian on All Souls' Day. Look, there is wet mud splashed all over it." At that moment the chapel bells began to ring and Iltud hurried off in their direction. "Yes, you are right," I called after him, almost unaware of what I was saying. "The road to Isker was muddy last night."